We all know the story of the fall of Rome. If not, the brief version is this: a mighty empire, spanning from Britain to the Middle East, grew weak over centuries, was overrun by barbarian tribes, and finally collapsed in the West around 476 AD, plunging Europe into the Dark Ages. It's a tale of military collapse. But what if we've been looking at it wrong? What if the fatal blow wasn't struck by a Germanic axe on a muddy frontier, but by an accountant's stylus in a dusty ledger in Rome? This is the story of an economic weapon of mass destruction, disguised as a simple tax. A policy designed to save an empire that instead bankrupted it from the inside out. This is the story of the Vicesima Hereditatium, the Roman inheritance tax, and how it triggered a chain reaction of capital flight, a crumbling tax base, and the hyperinflation that strangled the world's greatest superpower. We will follow this story from its well-intentioned beginning under Augustus, through its slow, corrosive effects over 3 centuries, to its catastrophic role in the final collapse. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a case study in how an economy can be killed by paper cuts. Our story begins not at the end, in chaos, but at a pinnacle of order. The year is 27 BC. After decades of civil war, Octavian, now known as Augustus, has become the first emperor of Rome. He looks out over an empire exhausted by conflict but unimaginably wealthy. His first task is to secure peace, and for that he needs 2 things: a loyal, professional army and a stable, funded government. To pay for this new permanent army, the legendary legions, he needs a permanent, reliable source of revenue, and he finds it in a brilliant and seemingly fair new tax, the Vicesima Hereditatium, a 5% tax on inheritances. But there was a catch, a huge one. It only applied to Roman citizens, and it was exclusively levied on money and property left to individuals who were not closely related to the deceased. In essence, it was a tax on the wealth of the elite, as it passed between friends, distant relatives, and political allies. Augustus, the savvy politician, had framed it not as a burden on the family, but as a contribution from the rich to the state that protected them. For a while it worked. The treasury filled, the legions were paid, and the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, began. For the 1st century AD, the empire thrived. The inheritance tax was just a background hum, a minor cost of doing business for the senatorial and equestrian classes. But beneath the surface of marble and gold, a slow poison was entering the system. The Roman elite, the very people who owned most of the empire's wealth, began to feel the state's reach into their private affairs. For generations, building a vast patrimony to pass on was the ultimate goal of a Roman aristocrat. It was their legacy. Now, the state had declared itself a silent partner in that legacy. A subtle but critical shift began. The interests of the wealthy and the interests of the state were no longer perfectly aligned. The first major stress test came in the 2nd century AD. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, was forced to fight protracted, expensive wars on the Danube frontier against Germanic tribes. The treasury was strained. To raise funds, the tax pressure increased. Officials became more aggressive in their assessments and collections. The elite, who had always seen themselves as partners in running the empire, now started to feel like its prey. They began to look for ways to hide their wealth, to shield it from the imperial taxman. This was the beginning of capital flight. It started small, underreporting the value of estates, making quiet, informal gifts to heirs before death to avoid the tax altogether. The cleverest of the rich began moving their assets away from liquid, easily valued cash and land, and into tangible, hard-to-assess goods, massive collections of jewels, gold plate, and works of art. This was wealth that was effectively taken out of circulation, hoarded in vaults instead of being invested in trade, land improvement, or loans. The situation went from bad to catastrophic in the 3rd century. This period, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, was a perfect storm of disaster. The empire was rocked by civil wars, as general after general fought for the throne. Plague swept through the population, killing millions and devastating the labor force. And all the while, foreign pressure on the frontiers intensified. The imperial government was desperate, and its solution was to drastically increase spending on the army, doubling their pay, and buying the loyalty of the soldiers to prevent further revolts. But where was this money to come from? The inheritance tax and other traditional revenue streams were failing. The wealthy had become too good at evasion, and the broader economy was shrinking. So the emperors resorted to the oldest trick in the book. They debased the currency. They took the silver denarius, the backbone of the Roman economy, and slowly reduced its silver content, mixing in cheaper metals like copper. At first, it was a slight reduction, then more brazen. By the time of Emperor Gallienus around 260 AD, the denarius was less than 5% silver. It was a copper coin with a silver wash. The effect was immediate and devastating. Hyperinflation. Prices skyrocketed. A measure of wheat that cost a handful of coins now cost a wheelbarrow full. The government's own savings, held in the very currency it was debasing, became worthless. This was a direct, self-inflicted wound caused by the failure of the tax system. The state was now starving for real, tangible wealth. gold and silver, and productive assets, the Emperor Diocletian, a fierce and pragmatic ruler, saw the chaos and tried to fix it at the end of the 3rd century. He understood the state was bankrupt. His solution was to abandon the pretense of a voluntary tax system altogether. He tied people to their professions and their land. Peasants became tied to their farms, their sons forced to be peasants. Craftsmen were bound to their trades, their sons forced to continue it. This was the beginning of serfdom, the economic system that would define the Middle Ages. It was born out of Roman tax desperation. To combat the hyperinflation, he issued his famous edict on maximum prices, setting legal price caps on thousands of goods and services. It was a complete failure. Goods simply vanished from the market, sold instead on a rampant black market. The edict was unenforceable and was eventually abandoned. Diocletian's reforms were a testament to how far the empire had fallen. The state was no longer a facilitator of commerce. It was a prison warden, trying to commandeer an economy it had already destroyed. The final act came in the 4th and 5th centuries. The inheritance tax was now a relic. The state's primary focus was on squeezing whatever it could from the land through its now immobile population of serfs, and from a brutal and comprehensive head tax. The burden fell overwhelmingly on the poor and the middle class, the very people who could least afford it. The wealthy senatorial class, who had spent centuries perfecting tax avoidance, lived in fortified villas on vast, self-sufficient estates, largely independent of the crumbling imperial economy. They paid minimal taxes and hoarded their gold. When the Visigoths, led by Alaric, demanded a ransom not to sack Rome in 408 AD, the Senate in Rome had to melt down gold and silver statues from the temples to pay it. The private wealth of the aristocracy was untouchable. The state was hollowed out. A few years later, in 410 AD, when Alaric returned and the city could not pay again, the gates were opened and Rome was sacked. The empire in the west limped on for a few more decades, but it was a corpse. It had no money, no stable economy, and no way to pay its armies. In 496 AD, the German general Odoacer simply deposed the last Roman emperor, a boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus. There was no grand final battle. The empire didn't fall. It filed for bankruptcy. So what are we to make of this? The barbarians were not the cause of Rome's fall. They were the final symptom. The real killer was a financial cancer that started with a single tax. The Vicesima Hereditatium initiated a slow-motion disaster. It alienated the empire's wealthiest citizens, encouraging them to hide their assets and withdraw their economic support. This created a permanent budget crisis that led to currency debasement, which in turn led to hyperinflation, which destroyed the middle class and forced the state to enslave its population to survive. The Roman Empire did not collapse under the weight of its own grandeur. It withered away from a lack of funds, proving that the most powerful army in the world is useless if you can't afford to pay it. The lesson echoes through the centuries. An economy cannot survive when its most productive members are incentivized to hide from the state rather than invest in its future. The fall of Rome wasn't an invasion. It was a quiet financial implosion,